Margaret Chen arrived at Mercy General Hospital on a Tuesday morning with a small bag, a coffee she had not finished, and the kind of expression that gave nothing away. The charge nurse, a woman named Beverly, who had worked the same ward for 19 years, walked her through the hallways with the careful politeness of someone who had already made up her mind. She showed Margaret the supply room, the break room, the locker that stuck a little on the left side, and the patient board, where the names changed but the problems never really did. "We like things done a certain way here," Beverly said. "Of course," Margaret said. That was the whole conversation. Margaret was 34 years old. She was not tall. She did not have the kind of loud presence that fills a room before a person even speaks. She wore her dark hair pulled back, kept her uniform neat, and moved through the ward the way water moves, finding the right path without making a fuss about it. The other nurses were polite to her, in the distant way people are polite to someone they expect to leave soon. They answered her questions, and did not ask her any. They assumed, from her quiet, that she was uncertain. They assumed, from her smallness, that she was fragile. They assumed, from her lack of stories, that she had none. None of those things were true. But Margaret was not in the business of correcting people before they needed correcting. She had learned, in harder places than this, that people reveal their understanding of you on their own schedule. You cannot rush it. You simply do the work and wait. So she worked. She was scheduled for nights, mostly. The overflow cases. The admissions that came in after midnight, when the full-time staff had gone home, and the ward ran on whoever was left. It was not glamorous work. It was not the kind of work that got mentioned in staff meetings or written up in hospital newsletters. Margaret did not mind. She had, in a previous life, been responsible for keeping 20 soldiers alive in a mountain range at 2 in the morning, in weather that had no interest in their survival. Night shifts at Mercy General were not, comparatively, a great challenge. But she did not say this. She poured coffee, checked charts, administered medications, updated records, and went home in the morning light to a small apartment where she had one plant, a good mattress, and a shoebox on the top shelf of her closet that she never opened. Weeks passed. Then months. A physician named Dr. Lester began a habit of repeating her observations in meetings as if they were his own. Not maliciously, exactly. More the way a man who has never been told he is doing something wrong simply continues doing it. Margaret noted it and filed it somewhere internal. Dr. Lester was not, in the long history of men who had underestimated her, a particularly interesting entry. There was a Tuesday staff meeting in November where she laid out a clear, specific case for changing the fluid protocol on a particular type of cardiac patient. She had 3 weeks of data. She had read 6 recent studies. She had written a single clean page of notes. The table listened politely. Dr. Lester said, "I think there might be something to a revised fluid approach." 12 minutes later. The table nodded. Margaret looked at the window. Outside, a pigeon was sitting on the ledge doing absolutely nothing, and she found this briefly comforting. She fixed the broken locker with a strip of medical tape one evening after her shift. It held. Small victories, she thought. You take them. Winter came. The ward got busier. Margaret got better at reading the rhythms of the place. Which patients needed conversation, and which needed silence. Which families needed reassurance, and which needed honesty. Which colleagues wanted help, and which only wanted to appear to want help. She was, in ways that nobody had quite named yet, the person the ward was beginning to quietly rely on. Not officially, not with any acknowledgement, but when something uncertain happened at 3 in the morning, people turned toward her without quite knowing they were doing it. She noticed. She did not comment. Then came the Thursday in March. It was 9:47 in the morning when the first ambulance pulled in, and by 9:52, there were 3 more behind it, and a 5th behind that. The radio chatter had started a few minutes earlier. Something about a military training accident at a wilderness site 4 hours north. Something about a mountaineering exercise gone very wrong in bad weather. 20 men. All of them from the same special operations unit. Hypothermia in 3 of them, serious enough for intensive care. Lacerations on most of the others. One with a punctured lung. One with a broken femur that had been splinted in the field by someone who clearly knew what they were doing. The ward tilted. There is a particular kind of chaos that a mass casualty event creates in a civilian hospital, not because the staff are incapable, but because everything happens at once, and the usual order of things stops being useful. Forms and procedures and chains of authorization, which work perfectly well when emergencies arrive one at a time, suddenly feel like trying to open a gate while a river is coming through. Margaret put down the chart she was holding. She did not run. She did not shout. She moved into the middle of the arriving chaos with the same quietness she brought to everything, and she began. She triaged the 3 hypothermic patients in under 4 minutes, directing them to treatment rooms with specific instructions that the attending nurses followed, because her voice had the quality of someone who is not asking. She called out warming protocols, IV placements, monitoring requirements. She identified the punctured lung by the sound of the man's breathing before anyone had put a stethoscope to him, and she said so, clearly, to the physician who had just arrived and was still reading the intake form. He looked at her. He listened. He confirmed it 30 seconds later. Beverly tried to interrupt once about the admission paperwork. Margaret looked at her. Beverly did not raise the paperwork again. For 40 minutes the ward was a controlled storm, and at the center of it was a small woman with her hair pulled back who moved like someone who had done this, or something very much like it, so many times that the fear had long ago been replaced by a kind of clarity that most people never find at all. The femur patient went to the operating room. The lung patient stabilized. The 3 men with hypothermia were warming, their vitals moving in the right direction, their bodies pulling back from the edge they had been standing on. At 10:31, the ward went quiet. The specific quiet after a crisis is different from ordinary quiet. It is heavier. It is aware of itself. People stand in it for a moment before they remember how to move normally. Margaret was checking the monitoring on the eldest of the hypothermic patients, a man in his mid-40s with a weathered face and a row of small tattoos on his left forearm that were not decorative, when he opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the IV line. He looked at her. His voice came out rough and slow, dragged through hypothermia and exhaustion, and the particular disorientation of someone who has been very close to a very bad outcome. "Chief?" he said. Just that one word. Margaret did not answer for a moment. She checked his temperature reading. She adjusted the warming blanket at his shoulder. "You're at Mercy General Hospital," she said. "You're stable. Rest." But something had begun. The man in the next bed had been drifting in and out of a medicated sleep. He opened his eyes at the sound of that one word, the same way a person wakes at a sound they recognize from deep in their memory, not alarmed, but suddenly present. He looked at Margaret for a long moment. "Ma'am," he said, quiet, certain, not a question. Then the man by the window, then the one near the door, one after another, as if something had been passed between them without words, which perhaps it had. People who have spent enough time in difficult places together develop a kind of language that has nothing to do with speaking. They had not recognized her on arrival. They had been cold and injured and disoriented, arriving in a hospital that was all noise and bright light and unfamiliar faces. But something about the way she moved, the way she gave direction, the way the room had reorganized itself around her decisions, their nervous systems had known before their minds caught up. Now their minds caught up. Across the ward, the word moved. Commander, Captain Chen, Ma'am, Chief. 20 men, various states of injury and medication, each of them rearranging whatever understanding they had built of this place in the last 2 hours. Beverly was standing in the hallway entrance. Dr. Lester was somewhere behind her, clipboard in hand, with the specific expression of a man who is revising several months of assumptions simultaneously and finding the process uncomfortable. Dr. Kaminsky, the attending physician who had watched Margaret work that morning with increasing attention, looked at the room, and then at Margaret, and then back at the room again, the way you look at something when you understand you have been looking at it wrong. Margaret did not perform anything for any of them. She moved to the next patient, checked his laceration dressings, noted his temperature, asked him in a calm and professional voice how his pain level was on a scale of 1 to 10. He told her 4. She made a note. She moved on. The story, once it started moving, moved fast. Within the hour it had reached the nursing station, the break room, the administrator's office on the 4th floor, and a group of medical students who had been doing rounds on the floor below. By afternoon, it had the shape that remarkable things acquire when they are passed from person to person, slightly larger than the truth, slightly more dramatic, but in this case not very much so, because the truth was already quite large on its own. What the hospital records confirmed, to those who thought to look: 12 years of active service. Army Ranger Regiment. The first female officer in the history of that regiment to command a company in direct combat operations. 2 tours in difficult geography, under conditions that the official reports described in language designed to make difficult things sound manageable. A service commendation that was written in formal language but meant something simple, that people had come home who would not have come home without her. She had left the military quietly, the same way she did everything. No public statements, no interviews. She had gone to nursing school in the same deliberate way she had gone to everything, because the work was something she understood, because keeping people alive was a skill she had been practicing for over a decade, because the hospital ward and the mountain and the field were all, in the ways that mattered, asking the same question of her. Can you hold this together? She could. She always could. Dr. Kaminsky found her in the break room at 2 in the afternoon. Margaret was pouring coffee and looking out the small window at the parking structure, which was not an interesting view, but she seemed to find it acceptable. Dr. Kaminsky sat down across the table without being invited, which Margaret noted without minding. I owe you an apology, Dr. Kaminsky said. She said it directly, the way a person who has decided to say something says it, without softening it into something easier. Several, probably. This morning was extraordinary. And the months before this morning were also something I should have been paying closer attention to. Margaret brought both cups to the table and set one in front of the doctor. Yes, she said. You should have. She sat down. She drank her coffee. She let the silence be what it was. The fluid protocol, Dr. Kaminsky said. The data is in my notes from the November meeting. Nothing has changed about the data. Dr. Kaminsky nodded. I'll read it this week. Good. That was the whole conversation about that. They sat for a few more minutes in the kind of quiet that is not uncomfortable, exactly, but is honest. The quiet of 2 people who are working out, without saying so, what the next version of things is going to look like. Then Margaret finished her coffee and went back to work. She had 4 hours left on her shift. The ward, for the rest of that day and the days that followed, rearranged itself around her, in ways both large and small. Beverly stopped scheduling her for overflow only. Dr. Lester stopped repeating her observations, at least not without attribution, which was a start. The new medical students, when they rotated through, were quietly pointed in her direction. She did not become a different person. She was precisely who she had always been, which was, it turned out, more than enough. The 20 men recovered. Most of them sent cards. One of them, the man with the tattoos who had spoken first, came back 3 weeks later on his own time and asked at the nursing station if he could speak with Captain Chen. Nurse Chen, the receptionist said, still learning. He smiled. Yes, ma'am, that's the one. Margaret came out to the waiting room, and they spoke for a few minutes about nothing in particular. His recovery, the weather, whether the hospital coffee was always this bad, which it was. He told her the team had voted to name something after her in the manner that soldiers do when they want to honor someone without making a speech. She told him that was unnecessary. Yes, ma'am, he said. We know. He shook her hand and left. She stood for a moment in the waiting room, which smelled like floor wax and old magazines, and thought about a dozen things at once, the way you do when a long and complicated chapter of your life presses itself briefly into the present. Then she went back inside. The locker that did not close all the way was still held shut by a strip of medical tape, which was not a permanent solution, but was a working one. She had been meaning to ask maintenance about it for months. She decided she would ask today. Not because it mattered greatly, because it was a small thing that could be fixed, and she had a long history of fixing things, large and small, and she saw no reason to stop now.